I'm just thrilled to be here. I speak pretty loudly. I'm not sure if I really need this, but I hope, can you all hear me pretty well? As you know, I am Joan Adler, and I've been working with the Straus family for 23 years. And sometimes I like to tell people that I'm the world's expert on the Straus family. I don't know a whole lot about maritime matters, except as it relates to the family, but I will try and impart what I do know. Of course, I have to thank Ken and Jeff Seymour, who we have been emailing fast and furiously to put this all together, and they've been wonderfully responsive and interested, which is just great. You know, we love to be able to talk about the family, and we love to be able to share what we know. So the fact that you were here, I'm really thrilled, because I was here in 2001, and so many of the people I met then have returned to hear me speak. It couldn't have been terrible, because they came back. But it's really wonderful to see so many old friends, and I thank you for coming. I have to also thank Stephen Wise for his excellent book, Lifeline of the Confederacy, Blockade Running During the Civil War, and Charles A. Masulia, who wrote 1865, the last battle of the Civil War, because I write a newsletter for the family twice a year, and the last issue, which was published at the end of August, was about those two issues, about blockade running and about the burning of Columbus. And I really, as much as I know about the Straus family, I would not have been able to write my articles without the expert information from these two men. There's one other person, well, actually two other people I'd like to thank. One is Terry Jackson, who's here. He has been a little bit of a thorn in my side, but in a very wonderful way, because he has been correcting all of the stupid things I've been writing and saying, and he's been very gently telling me history in a way that brings it very much to life. And then I also have to thank, I wish you would all turn around and see my wonderful assistant, Catherine Smith. Catherine is the person who really makes me look good. She is young enough to know how to work the internet. She has revised our website and brought that to life. We have a Facebook page. Jennings Palmer liked us this morning, which is just wonderful. Come and visit our Facebook page. We try to post at least once a week, depending on how busy we are, or twice a week. As I will tell you later, I also have a personal Facebook page, thanks to Catherine, and I'd love for you to come visit that as well. So let's get started. In order to understand about the Strauses, you need to know something about their involvement in Georgia. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Whoops, what did I do? Okay, we're good. So the Strauses originated in the southwestern portion of Germany. You can see where it says Autobiography. That piece of Germany was sometimes France and sometimes Germany, depending on the political situation of the day. The Strauses were educated people. They spoke French, they spoke German, and they spoke Hebrew. They were well-to-do people as well. They bought and sold fields and grain. They had wine business, they had cattle business. We hear a lot of times that Jews were not allowed to do those things, but indeed in this area of the world they were. Then came I'm going to stop right here. This is the house that Lazarus and Sarah lived in Germany. We took the family there in 2006, and the house is still standing. The name Straus, if you look at any of our literature, you'll see a little ostrich. And the reason it's there is because the name Straus, the word Straus, is ostrich. Now, that seems a little odd in the middle of Germany to have somebody decide in 1808 that they want their name to mean something that means ostrich. And the story we have been told, we do not know if it's true, is that outside the door they didn't have house numbers the way we do, but they had little bas-relief plaques. And at their home there was a picture of an ostrich on a bas-relief plaque. I kind of hoped that they would have a name Straus with two final S's, because that means a bunch of flowers. And that's a much prettier picture. But oh well, you do what you can. In 1848, there was a revolution in this area. In fact, pretty much all over Europe. The idea was to codify the Jews. And while Lazarus did not participate in that revolution, he did raise funds for it. People did very poorly economically at that time. He was the oldest of 14. His father had died in 1838, and he was the head of the family. He sold some of his fields in order to raise money for his siblings who were having a tough time. And the people who bought these fields reneged on the deal. So in 1852, he learned that he was going to be called before the courts to explain his involvement in the revolution. And he was not so happy about that. And he also was facing bankruptcy. And so rather than endanger his family, what was left of the family, he decided maybe it was time to emigrate. So in the summer of 1852, he went to Le Havre, which is where people were leaving from in those days. It was a trip of about 2 or 3 days. And he went to Philadelphia, which in the United States was the center of German-Jewish commerce. There was a huge German-Jewish population at the time. And he was advised that if he was going to start over, there would be lots of good opportunities for him in the South. And so he traveled to Oglethorpe, where he found the Kaufman brothers. It's not clear if he knew them beforehand. They certainly came from the same area. They came from a little town called Lichtenau, which is very close to where the Strauses lived in Autobiography. And we have lots of letters of warmth and friendship, and when the Strauses did go back to Germany, they visited with the Kaufmans and were left behind. But it's not clear 100% whether they knew them or just went there because they knew. It's called a landsman, someone from your home area. But in any event, Lazarus went there. They set him up with a pushcart, and he pedaled. He had a route. He wound up going to Talbot on court day, and he said this was the first civilized place that he found. So here we have a picture of Lazarus and Sarah as they would have appeared when they were living in Talbot. This picture was certainly taken in Georgia. He sent for his family and the 4 children. And I'm going to step out a bit just so I hope you can hear me. This is the manifest from when Sarah came to the United States. She came in 1854. Lazarus had established a dry goods firm in Talbot with Captain Curley, who was a farmer, yes? And he took half the store, and then he felt settled enough to send for his kids. So here is his wife. We know her name was Sarah, but she's listed as Marie. I believe probably they were saying Mère in French. And here's Isidor, who was listed as 12 years old when in fact he was 9. And he's also listed as a female. And it goes on like that. We have Herman, who was actually Hermione, who was not 10 and who was not male. So those of you who do genealogy understand that one has to take everything with a grain of salt. One has to do further research to figure this all out. They were also traveling with a girl, a servant. Sarah had a stroke before they left, about 2 years before they left, and her arm was partially paralyzed. So here she was traveling with 4 very, very young children. She came in 1854, and Oscar, the youngest, was born in 1850. So this is quite remarkable. But she did travel with a servant girl who was there to help her. We have no idea if that woman came to Georgia with her or if she stayed in New York. They landed in New York. Lazarus was waiting on the dock for them. They were so excited to see him. They traveled to Philadelphia where he had friends, and they stayed there for several weeks because there was yellow fever in the South. Eventually they did take a ship to Savannah, a train to Geneva, and then a rockaway, a horse-drawn cart, to their home in Talbot. Here we have the Straus sons. This is Isidor, who was the oldest. He was about 9 when he came. And that's Oscar, the youngest, with him. And then Nathan, who was the 3rd child, the 2nd son and the 3rd child. And these pictures were also taken in Talbot at the time. They had a daughter, Hermina, who married Lazarus Combs. And he was in the South with his brother David. They met and they married in the South, and when the family moved north after the war, he came along with them and worked in the family business. Nathan, even as a young boy, was a wheeler dealer. He was always looking to make a buck. And we have really wonderful stories about Nathan. During the war, they were selling these balls of talc, and he would break them up into tiny little pieces because he could sell them for more money in the aggregate. But the family's most favorite story is that because his mother was handicapped in some way because of the stroke, he bought her a very pregnant slave, thinking that when the baby was born, they'd have two for the price of one. It didn't occur to him that she was so pregnant that she couldn't do much work, and then the baby was born, and now they had two mouths to feed instead of one. But the family's very tickled with this story, and it's passed down all the time. Lazarus now took on business partners, the Kaufman brothers, Jacob, Julius, and Charles. And they had stores in Talbot and Geneva and Fort Gaines. They also originally had a store in Carsonville, but that store didn't stay open too long from what I understand. We have one letter from 1859 where Isidor had gone to help the partners in Carsonville and was writing back to his family. Although basically dry goods establishments, they also carried all kinds of merchandise that they had obtained on regular buying trips north. And even as a boy, Isidor helped out at the store. The partners would go home for dinner, and he would come back and do his homework in the store because it was cheaper for them to heat the store than the home, and he could do his work by the store light, by the firelight, and then he could help his family at the same time. And he decided that he wanted to go to West Point. One of the neighborhood boys got an appointment to West Point, and he thought that sounded pretty wonderful. But then the war broke out, and that was the end of that. He certainly couldn't go north. So he decided that he might go to Marietta, to the military academy. At the beginning of the war, some of the boys in town decided to form a troop. And they were boys between the age of 16 and 18. But the governor said that we can't even arm and feed and clothe the men we have. We certainly couldn't do that for boys. So he was discouraged. So he went to Marietta. This is Georgia Military Academy in Marietta, to try and get a military education there. He heard that there was somebody, an acquaintance of his, at the school, and so he went to visit the boy who invited him back to his living quarters. And he didn't notice that the door was ever so slightly ajar, and as he opened it, a bucket full of water fell on his head. And that was the end of that. He had no interest in being with people like that. So he went back to his hotel, dried himself off, got his clothes, hired a buggy, went to a mill, bought some grain, and that was the beginning of his mercantile and business career. He made some money. He said, "This is great. That's what I want to do with my life." And he wondered in his autobiography if maybe that one incident really, truly changed the course of his life, and I imagine that it did. The Strauses were active in their community and enjoyed life in Talbot. But in September of 1862, during the war, there was a presentment by Talbot County accusing the Jews of usury. And Lazarus was so hurt by this that he packed his family up and they moved to Columbus, where they lived from 1863 to 1865. They packed everything they owned into one cart and moved the 38 miles in one day. Nathan and Oscar had a pony, so they brought the pony along too. And at the end of the war, Wilson took his pony, and he never forgot that. Talked about it for years. Earlier in the year, in April of 1861, President Abraham Lincoln issued a blockade proclamation. Ships interfering with the commerce of the Union would be treated under the laws of piracy. England quickly recognized the state of war between the two factions and declared their own neutrality. This was an act seen by the Union as a support sympathetic to the South. From the beginning of the war, leaders of the Confederacy realized they'd have to obtain great quantities of military supplies from abroad. I mean, you all know the South is pretty agrarian. The mostly rural agrarian South had not developed an industrial base and found itself without the military armaments necessary to conduct a protracted war. The South didn't have a merchant fleet large enough to bring supplies from Great Britain, Nassau, Bermuda, or Havana. In order to remedy this, companies were formed all over the South, like the Georgia Importing and Exporting Company. And this is a newspaper clipping that appeared at the time in the local paper. And it reads, this is from July 17, 1863. It announced the formation, quote, for the purpose of obtaining and carrying on direct trade with foreign countries, unquote. Lazarus was one of its subscribers. Each subscriber pledged a specific amount to the company, generally in bales of cotton, and expected to receive profits in direct proportion to the amount of each subscription. Lazarus' son-in-law, Lazarus Combs, and his brother David were also subscribers, as was Simon Rothschild and his brother Frank, names you all know, Lloyd G. Bowers, and Charlie Lamar. On September 19, 1863, Isidor wrote to his uncle Emmanuel, this was Lazarus' brother, who was in San Francisco, quote, the war in which the South has been engaged within the last 3 years has called upon the requisition from time to time of all the resources within her command. Men were called out from 18 to 35, and I approached the age faster than circumstances looked favorable. This made the climate a little too hot, and I began to look for a cooler spot. A company was made up in our city for the purpose of purchasing ships. Me as his assistant, with the understanding that I would pay my own expenses. And if I were to succeed in negotiating, then I were to purchase the merchandise wherein the ships were to be loaded. Father was very anxious for me to accept this position, as it was one of the few chances which men offered wherein I could so honorably bid farewell to our once happy but now almost miserable country, unquote. Isidor was taken on by the Georgia Importing and Exporting Company as a secretary of Lloyd G. Bowers. And we have Miss Effie Bowers here today, and her nephew, and another relative who are descendants. And that's pretty wonderful. He traveled to Charleston, where in his first letter home on June 18, 1863, he wrote, arrived here save and dirty. We met here with Charlie Lamar, the celebrated African trader, who was going with us. He is a very fine man. Mr. Bowers is a perfect gentleman. Pretty nice that we have that. Isidor found passage on the Alice. We were unable to find a photo or an illustration of the Alice, but this, I think, is a pretty good representation of a typical blockade running ship. He found passage on the Alice, which left that night. He rode home from Nassau, succeeded in running by 17 ironclads and monitors without even being discovered, much less fired upon. That must have been very calming for his mom. Theirs was the only ship successfully to leave Charleston Harbor that night. Isidor wore an undershirt-like garment into which his mother had sewn $1,200 in gold. He was required to lie quietly below the waterline so as not to make any noise until the Alice was safely out of Charleston Harbor. He described his appearance after being allowed on deck as that of a man who had been in the Russian baths. You can imagine what a contract between the Alice's Captain James Carlin with William C. B. and Company in August of 1863, 2 months later, after Isidor ran the blockade, reads, I do hereby agree with William C. B. and Companies, agents of the Importing and Exporting Company of South Carolina, that my compensation in full for services rendered the said company as master of the steamship Alice shall be as follows. 1/2 of all passage money to be paid me. For the first outward bound trip, the said ship to Nassau, New Providence, $4,000 payable in Nassau. For the first inward trip of the said ship to Charleston, $15,000 payable in currency of the Confederate State of America, the United States. That's pretty amazing, at least to me. The Alice, previously called the Matagorda, was owned by the Importing and Exporting Company of South Carolina. She averaged 925 bales of cotton each trip and could bring in a profit of about $100,000. That's in 1863 money. It's about $1,340,000 today. This company paid out 9,000 Confederate dollars to its shareholders, 120 pounds English currency, per share. Since it's estimated that only 10% of these steamers made more than one trip through the blockade, although there was enormous profit to be made, sometimes as much as $250,000 per run, there was also enormous risk. Only 2 successful trips brought in enough profit to compensate for the loss of the ship on the 3rd run. The price of cotton in the South in April of 1863 was 6 cents per pound, 50 cents or greater per pound in London when it was sold. But as the war continued, Confederate money was worth less. Fewer blockade runners were being able to escape from Confederate ports, and profits diminished in the South. As the South's ability to ship goods to Europe evaporated. In the end, it's speculated that investing in England would have been more profitable than in the cotton exporting business. Blockade running was dangerous. Many ships were sunk before leaving the harbor. In June 1863, Bowers and Lamar decided that they might have better luck in Wilmington, North Carolina, instead of at Charleston, and so they left Isidor in Charleston, and they went to Wilmington, reasoning that Isidor was a boy, and that even if he was caught, even if there was a problem, they wouldn't harm him because he was still young. He was 18 at the time. Isidor arrived in Nassau, New Providence on June 21st, 1863, and after a stopover in New York, arrived in London on July 24th. When Isidor left Charleston, he had a letter of introduction from Frank Rothschild's wife, Amanda, to her father, Nathan Blunt, who was living in New York. At the time, Isidor had no way of knowing if he was going to New York, because it was quite dangerous for Southerners to go to the north. But the letter of introduction was most welcome, just in case. As it turns out, Isidor did stop in New York on his way to Europe, and he did receive the hospitality of Nathan Blunt. And this is important because, although he didn't mention it in his letters at the time, Nathan Blunt had another daughter beside Amanda, whose name was Ida. And Ida would have been about 13 or 14 years old when Isidor was there, and he probably was not particularly interested in her. He was on a very important mission. However, in 1871, when Isidor was settled in New York, he married Ida Blunt. And that's pretty terrific. So we have lots of connections with the South through the Rothschilds, through Amanda, and also through the Blunt family. They reunited in 1871. She was a lovely 22-year-old who quickly captured not only his interest but his heart. They became engaged in April and married July 12th at the home of her father. Okay, back to my narrative. We got to get to England. Isidor arrived in England expecting to begin selling the cotton cargo from the ship right away and buying stock for the return trip. And he was really ready for this. He wrote home that he was advised by Bowers that with the present state of things, that there's no use in attempting anything, that there were no possibilities, and that perhaps he should go to Germany and visit with his relative for a while to save on money. And so he did. He went to Germany for about 3 months. By the end of the war, only one blockade runner was commissioned by the Georgia Importing and Export Company, using the proceeds from sale of cotton in England. She was built by William Simons and Company in Renfrew, Scotland, and she ran into a wreck of the Georgiana while trying to enter Charleston Harbor August 31st, 1864, and was a total loss. And Ken was nice enough to bring down their model. This is the model of the Mary Bowers that was built by that company. I have a photo of it here from our last trip. Isidor remained in Europe throughout the remainder of the war, at first at a loss for what to do with his time. He didn't like the prospect of wasting time without some kind of gainful employment, and for now Bowers and Company didn't need his services. Finally, after 3 months visiting relatives, he returned to Liverpool, and upon advice of an uncle and some acquaintances, he established himself in the bond trading business. He complained of not receiving mail or instructions from home, while others were getting letters regularly. He wrote, quote, "You must use your efforts in forwarding letters by blockade steamers, as we receive mail from Nassau and Bermuda," unquote. Another quote, "I have speculated a little cotton with Elias Hayman," I'm sure that's a name many of you know here too, "and made 120 pounds in English currency. For my part," unquote. Isidor sent shoes, silk gloves, kid gloves, and thread home for his sister and his mother, and a 2-year Hebrew calendar for his father, stating that no matter the price at home, it was cheaper to buy goods in England and send them home. On December 19, 1863, he wrote, "I fear the ship is lost, and I hope that you have provided. It may still be afloat, but it will sink." Don't keep on hand much white goods. On the same day he wrote in another letter, yours of the 28th of October by flag of truce has come to hand. But the difficulty with letters sent by this means seems to be that they are not allowed to contain business matters. He went as an 18-year-old boy and was left to his own devices. He had no idea how to do business, what to do. But he was of a nature that he quickly learned, and he decided that he was not going to just sit still. This is a bill of sale from 1864, sale of Confederate bonds. And you can see the name of Lloyd G. Bowers by Isidor Straus. That's pretty special, I think. He wrote, perhaps one can still accomplish something with Bowers. I feel he will do all in his power for me. On January 1864, Isidor wrote, all parties in the Confederacy having agents in this country have succeeded in placing funds to their credit in this country, and you should do the same. If you could purchase some more beaver skins, it would pay well to forward them, as they take up so little room that any steamer will carry them for you. They bring 75 cents to $1 apiece. Should you buy any, don't let anyone know your object, as few have thought of this. Spare no pains. One thimbleful in this country is worth a bushel in Dixie. When asking for goods to be sent, he reminded his father to send them to an agent in Wilmington, because Wilmington was the only remaining port available on the East Coast. Isidor wrote in February 1864, each stockholder of 100 bales of cotton in Bowers Company will receive from $125 to $200 in profit. Perhaps you could purchase some more advantageously. And then in July he wrote, should my friend Julius Kaufman desire to come out, I may be able to make arrangements for him. However, if you have any idea the war is ending soon, then I should not advise him to come. For whoever leaves the Confederacy during the war can surely never return when peace is restored. The general belief here is that the best business in the whole world will be in the South immediately after the war. And hence my object in so expressing my views, for we must make use of the time and establish a regular business between here and there. So as soon as you have any prospects for peace, rent a house in Wilmington or some other, southern seaport, where every spot will be occupied. Should Grant be defeated thoroughly, then the prospects for peace will be good. But this may only be a spark of hope. A resolution for the recognition of the Confederacy was to have been discussed in Parliament on the 12th of June, but the day for discussing same was postponed for a later date. And general belief here is that their object in postponing was to hear something more definite in regards to the pending campaign. He wrote from Cologne on October 1864, as for buying more goods to ship to you, it is not at all advisable at present on account of the expected attack on Wilmington, which renders blockade running more dangerous than ever. Since your letter, Atlanta and Mobile have fallen. Wilmington was the only remaining active Confederate port, and it was sealed off in January 1865 when the defenses at the mouth of Cape Fear River were captured at Charleston. On June 16, 1865, 2 years and 2 days short of his blockade running experience, Isidor wrote to his beloved mother and sister, thank God that after a period of 4 long succession years of bloodshed and civil strife, a bright star is once more seen in the distance, making its way slowly but surely through the thin mist of clouds which have enveloped the heavens. The tree of prosperity and harmony is once again seen, spreading further the buds of peace, which through its fragrance and green foliage invites the exhausted to seek rest and shelter under its refreshing shades. Today, 2 years past, I first was doomed to venture upon the search of these fruits, which that tree had failed to supply, at the sacrifice of life's greatest charms, home, sweet home. But it seems that after the roots, it once again gave tokens of life, yet remaining in its shattered frame, and from the moment began gradually to survive, so as to give good promise of an abundant harvest. Although I can pluck one of its relishes by being once again more able to make use of that means of intercourse which kind nature has applied to bring, as it were, distant relatives and friends, in speaking proximity, though oceans roll between and mountains shout their lofty peaks to the skies to obstruct the paths. Sad indeed were the news of the fights and hardships to which you, my dearest ones, were exposed in consequence of the armies and battles in your very midst. You know they prospered. We all know that. This is the first store of Roland Hussey Macy. There was actually a man named R.H. Macy. He was a ship captain from New England and had started many, many businesses and failed. Finally, in 1854, came to New York City and opened up R.H. Macy, a dry goods company. It was at the center of commerce at the time, which was on 14th Street and 6th Avenue. Macy and Nathan Straus developed a friendship, and they were on a buying trip to Europe in 1877 when Macy died. He had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter would not have inherited the business because girls just didn't do that in those days. And the son was a drunk. So he wasn't eligible to do that. He spent a lot of time in jail. And he was court-martialed. He was in the military and was court-martialed for his activities. And so there were a succession of first relatives and then outside partners. But none of them were doing really, really well with the business. In the meantime, the Strauses had opened a China crockery concession in the basement in 1874. And very quickly it was accounting for the majority of income from this building. They started to expand, so they took the building next door and the building behind and the building this way and the building that way, and finally there was no more room to expand. In 1888, they became partners in R.H. Macy, and by 1894 they owned the entire store. I should mention that in 1874, when they opened that crockery department and glass, they used to cut glass in the basement, that was the first time that home goods and dry goods were sold in the same store. And on that distinction, it became the first department store. They were always very proud of that. Isidor stayed in the store tending to business, while Brother Nathan, who had lots of energy and couldn't sit still, traveled the country opening up new markets and went to Europe on buying trips. And as their sons completed college, they also started working in the family business. Sarah died in 1876, and Lazarus lived until 1898. He was born in 1809, so he was quite old when he died. After his wife died, he went to live with his daughter Hermina and her family. And every Sunday the family had dinner together at her house, unless somebody was out of town. He remained active and involved in the store as long as he was able, and he was welcome. But little by little, Isidor and Nathan took over, and then as their sons got older, they also took over. By 1902, it became very, very clear that there was no more room to expand on 14th Street. Isidor had become very involved in city politics and knew what was happening. He was part of the Chamber of Commerce, and in fact had even been in the House of Representatives in 1894. He was considered an expert on tariff and was a great friend of Grover Cleveland. But they knew now that they could not stay in that location anymore. But because he had an in with city politics, he had heard that the subway was going to be extended to 34th Street. And he also knew that there was going to be a crosstown bus. And so they decided very, very quietly to start buying up all the land on 34th Street between 6th and 7th Avenue. It's called Herald Square. I'll tell you an interesting story. There's a little notch in the building here. Very, very quietly, they were buying up all these properties, but the man on the corner, who was a tobacconist, knew that they were buying these properties, and he started raising his price. He thought, I'm going to get really rich from this. And by the time the Strauses owned all of the other property, they still hadn't bought that piece. And he was ecstatic, thinking that now he was set. And the Strauses just said, nope, we're not interested, and built their store right around that little thing. And it's like that today. Right now, these days, there's a sunglass hut store there. If you ever see an ad of Macy's, you'll see a giant red banner above it that says World's Largest Department Store. But that little teeny tiny notch is still there today. They said, we're not going to be held hostage. And the bottom picture is a picture of 2 sons standing. This is opening day of Herald Square. About a week before the store opened, they closed the downtown store. And day and night, 24 hours, they had carts bringing the They didn't want to have any interruption of business. So 24 hours a day, they had carts bringing all their merchandise up. This Oscar, the youngest brother, is sitting in the chair, and I don't really know why he's there, because he was the only one who was not involved with Macy's at all, although he was very close. But those are Jesse and Percy, who are the two sons of Isidor. And here's pictures from a little bit later. But the Strauses always maintained L. Straus and Sons. And one of the things that they did beyond anything, no one could cut glass the way they could. And so on the 8th floor of Macy's building, they opened up a glass cutting shop. And the shoppers could wander in and watch them doing this. But those little triangular bags that are hanging from cord from the ceiling are filled with water that would drip onto a wheel as the glass. And there would be sparks flying all the time. And in those days, the floors of all these buildings were wood. And so they quickly realized that maybe this was not the brightest thing to do, because there was a great danger of fire, and the fire departments are not quite as good. They don't have automatic sprinklers. And so after a short time they discontinued that. They had lots and lots of other warehouses where they did this kind of thing, and indeed the Hoboken warehouse did burn to the ground subsequently because of sparks from one of this. And here's the world's largest store, and there's Sunglass Hut. And you can still see all the way on the top of the picture, you can still see that little notch in the building. They have added to the building. It's much taller now than it was originally, and they have expanded, as you know, all over the country, all over the world. But the store still has a notch. And I think they were really tickled about this. So that's the part of the story that everybody knows about the Strauses and Macy's and the blockade running. But as they are wont to say, they are so much more. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the so much more part. This is the youngest brother, Oscar. He didn't want to go into the family business. His father and brother supported his desire for an education, including college and law school at Columbia University in New York City. As early as 1865, Lazarus wrote to his family in Germany, stating, "Nathan's very valuable to me in business, only he does not have much patience to learn. But I want Oscar to go through all the schools, since he enjoys learning." Since we're talking about education, I'm just going to take a step away and remind you, Isidor never even went to high school because of the war. And by the time he returned from the war, he didn't want to go back to school. He was firmly entrenched in the business world and quite happy about that. Bless you. And Nathan moved to New York with his family and completed high school. But he was somebody with too much energy to sit still for anything, and so he never went beyond high school. And so Oscar was the only one who did this. And everybody supported that, anything he wanted to do. After graduation from law school, he worked in a law office and then, bless you, and then opened his own firm. But his health was suffering because he was working so hard, and so he decided to quit that. And he started writing articles and books and giving talks and lectures, and he became the founder of something called the YMHA, which is the Young Men's Hebrew Association. And in 1894, he was the founder of the American Jewish Historical Society and its first president. He drew the attention of politicians from both sides of the political aisle and was nominated to represent the United States as minister to Constantinople in 1887. Henry Ward Beecher, then one of the most famous clergymen in New York, wrote a letter of recommendation for Oscar to Grover Cleveland. Quote, "Of his fitness, there is a general consent that he is personally and in attainments eminently excellent. But I am interested in another quality, the fact that he is a Hebrew. The bitter prejudice against Jews, which obtains in many parts of Europe, ought not receive any countenance in America. It is because he is a Jew that I would urge his appointment as a fit recognition of this remarkable people, who are becoming large contributors to American prosperity, and whose intelligence, morality, and a large liberality in all public measures of welfare of society deserve and should receive from the hands of our government, some such recognition." Unquote. With his family's support, Oscar accepted the position and served until 1889, when Cleveland was defeated in the election. I'm sure you all know that ambassadorial positions are at the whim of the president. So when a president is voted out, all his ambassadors leave and then the new ones are appointed. So He served again in 98 to 99 under William McKinley. And then the position later became an ambassadorial position. First it was minister to Constantinople. Then it became an ambassadorial position, and he became ambassador to Turkey under Taft. He was also Secretary of Commerce and Labor, which was one position, under President Teddy Roosevelt, the first Jewish cabinet member. He served at the pleasure of both Republicans and Democrats. He became a permanent member of the Court of Arbitration at the International Court of Arbitration at The Hague, and was instrumental in the formation of the League of Nations. He wrote many books, including his own Autobiography, under 4 administrations from Cleveland to Taft in 1922. And we know a lot about the family's time in Talbot and in Georgia from his autobiography. He looked back very, very fondly on those days and spoke very highly of the welcoming of the people, his education, the time he spent there. After his death, in 1926, it was proposed that a statue be built to honor his years of public service. I should mention that when he was in his law years, he said if public service was a profession, that's what I'd like to do. But at that time, public service was not a profession, and I think he probably invented it. The statues were to be placed in front of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. But before it could be built, because everything happens really slowly in Washington, the Great Depression happened and then World War II. So it wasn't until 1947 that President Harry Truman finally dedicated this group of statues. It was going to be on a place near the Commerce Building that was going to be called Federal Triangle, and it was going to have lots of different statues and memorials in that section. But then the Commerce Building was demolished, and there's a rule in Washington, D.C. that once you dedicate a statue, it cannot be put into storage. And so where that building stood for many, many years, there was a parking lot. And this wonderful group of statues dedicated to Oscar Straus stood in a parking lot. And then in 1998, the new Ronald Reagan, I never get this right, Federal Building and International Trade Center was completed, and the statues were placed on the plaza. And once the building was dedicated, we talked the government into a rededication ceremony for this wonderful group of statues. And it was really quite a lovely and interesting experience. That center circle that you see is a reflecting pool. And around the edge it says Oscar S. Straus, author, statesman, lawyer. And then those 2 dark shades are these 2 statues that sit up high on granite pillars. And they're really very lovely. He was given many posthumous awards, including having the Oscar S. Straus Liberty Ship named for him. It was launched in 1943 in New Orleans, dedicated by his daughter came and smashed a bottle of champagne over its hull. It was number 97. There were 2,700 Liberty ships, so they were really anxious to dedicate something to him. Each ship could carry 9,000 tons of cargo. And for those of you who know about these kinds of things, it was an ET-1S C3 type Liberty ship. A note from H. Dean Hellis for Spencer Kellogg and Sons, agent of the War Administration, described her service. The Oscar S. Straus has been operating continuously since November 22, 1943, in the service of the War Shipping Department. The vessel made numerous voyages with fuel oil, so necessary to us and to our allies for the successful culmination of the war. From United States ports in the Mediterranean, including such ports as Gibraltar, Azores, Malta, the vessel also carried numerous cargoes under Lend-Lease from Haifa to Biarritz, Palermo, Naples, and Toronto. During the crucial period of the war, these voyages made in convoy, and fortunately with Oscar S. Straus, met with no misfortunes, though enemy action throughout this time. I've already told you that Nathan had far too much energy to be contained in a classroom or in an office. He was a man with a multitude of ideas, many of them involving how he could help his fellow man. He told a story about when the family was leaving Columbus to go up to Philadelphia. They traveled by train, and somehow he got separated from his family and was left on the station and he was a little boy. I mean, he was born in 1848, so he was not an adult. And he had no money. So he was there a whole day not knowing what to do, and he was starving and very frightened. And somebody finally gave him a penny, and he was able to buy ice cream with that penny. and then they helped him on to the next train. And this experience made such an impression on him that he vowed that he would help people who were hungry. And he did. He never forgot that experience. As you know, the family owned Macy's, and he was partners with his brother. Every year at Thanksgiving, he supplied a turkey to every employee anonymously. No one ever knew that. There was a coal strike in 1902, and he bought coal for needy people. He bought food for needy people. He never would accept money from other wealthy people. It was something that he wanted to do all by himself, and he did. He had a farm with some cows, and some of the cows died of tuberculosis because their idea about sanitary conditions in these days was not the same as what we have today. And he reasoned that if the cows were sick, that the milk was probably sick too. And so Louis Pasteur had invented a process to kill germs, but had not applied it to pasteurization. It was Nathan who coined that phrase. He built a pasteurization laboratory in New York City, taught people the process, researched it all, and then built milk depots all over New York City where people could buy low-cost or free milk. And particularly in the summer when conditions were really tough, they saved thousands of babies. He would give milk for free if people couldn't afford it, or otherwise they could buy it for a penny. And these milk bottles had a rounded bottom. And we have lots of stories about family members who have encountered others and said that they feel that their relatives were saved because of this. And then he went to Europe. He went all over the United States, and he went to Europe. And he said to municipalities, if you will send people to learn this process, I will pay to build the laboratory. And Nathan Straus brought pasteurization to the world, extraordinary, with his own money. He was the head of the Department of Health in New York City for a while, but then he had too many other things to do. He couldn't stay. He was, because we're talking about boats, he was an avid boatman, and he had many, many boats, sometimes multiple boats. This one is called the Cicilina. His wife's name was Lena, and his daughter's name was Sissy. They had a home in the Thousand Islands of New York State, which is upper New York State, just where Canada and New York State, on the St. Lawrence. There are lots of little islands. And they had lovely, and this was one of his boats. He had really fantastic homes up there. He sold this boat to the Coast Guard during World War I at just about no cost at all. And then he used the proceeds to feed war orphans, because that's what Nathan did. He funded, he went to Palestine and became very enamored. He became a staunch Zionist, and he funded the Jerusalem Health Center. Today it's called the Nathan and Lena Straus Health Center. And he also funded stations where people could learn a skill, where they could learn how to work, some kind of jobs. The city of Netanya in Israel is named for him. And the story is that they named it for him to honor him in the hopes that he would give them more money. But by the time they did that, he said, I've already given away 3/4 of my fortune. I really don't have a lot more to give. And so they sent the mayor to his home in just north of New York City, hoping that maybe they could have some conversations and the mayor could talk him into donating some money. And the mayor was really excited because he was going to stay at this fabulous home in Westchester County and be wined and dined by this wealthy guy. And he was pretty disgruntled when he came down for breakfast and was served cold cornflakes. He went home empty-handed and unhappy. Nathan vacationed, as people did in those days, in Lakewood, New Jersey, which is just a little bit down the Jersey coast. And the Lakewood Hotel, which was a famous hotel at the time, would not allow Jews. So he and several of his friends bought it. And they turned it into something called a preventorium. He was very interested, as you know, in tuberculosis. And he reasoned that if you had healthy children in a home where there was tuberculosis, the kids would come down with tuberculosis too. But if you took them out of that environment, it was like going to summer camp. They could have food that was nutritious and healthy, fresh air, exercise, and maybe it would build up their immune system and they would escape that disease. Now we're talking about 1910 maybe, so this is an extraordinary, yeah, that was extraordinary that anybody would reason something at that time. Nathan wrote Give until it feels good. He said, what you give in health is gold, what you give in sickness is silver, and what you give in debt is lead. And when he died in 1931, he had given away 3/4 of his fortune. His heirs were not too happy about that, but that's another story. He was revered all around the world for his selfless philanthropy. This is only one memorial, and unfortunately this one was never built because it was proposed in 1931, and then again the Depression and the war came, and it just never got built. But I think it's absolutely lovely, and so I've brought you this image as opposed to some others. And now we turn to Isidor, who I think is best known for the Titanic disaster. But as everyone in the family says, we are so much more. He was the head of R.H. Macy and L. Straus and Sons, which I've told you about. He and his brother built the 34th Street store with the assistance of Isidor's sons, Jesse and Percy. His youngest son, Herbert, was a little too young then. He was still in Harvard. And Nathan's sons were also too young, but they joined the family firms as they got bigger. He was asked to run for an unexpired seat in the House of Representatives in 1894 and won. He served as a close friend and advisor to President Grover Cleveland and was acknowledged as an expert on tariff reform. Like his brother Oscar, he felt it was his duty to serve when asked. But when his term expired, he requested that his name not be put up for an election again because his responsibilities at home were so great. I'll tell you a really quick story about Grover Cleveland's wife. The Strauses had a home in the Adirondacks in the summer, and Grover Cleveland would come and visit and stay at a cabin or shack or cottage somewhere in the area. And we have some letters written by Jesse, Isidor's son, about visiting the Clevelands, and his father would go in and talk with Grover Cleveland, and the wife would entertain the children. And he was so thrilled and excited because when he got home, he could describe Mrs. Cleveland lifting up her skirt. This was Sunday after church, and she lifted up her skirt and showed her garter with her pistol strapped to her leg. And he thought this was the best thing ever. And I think it's just a charming little insight into family. And I've included this site because it's so charming. This is 1907. The Strauses were at the Folies Bergère. And Isidor wrote, "We ate some birds for lunch. Mrs. Straus, my interpreter, translated them as swallows. In reality, they're larks. This is the consequence taken by electric light at night." And I just love the picture, so I thought you needed to see it. Isidor never emphasized, publicized his philanthropic endeavors. He did what he thought was right, what must be done, what he was able to do without the need for notoriety or publicity. I've seen his personal daytimers. He used to keep these little teeny tiny books. Every single night he had an appointment with some organization or another that he was on the board, he was supporting, he was helping in some way. He was the founder and the first president of the Educational Alliance, which was a settlement house in New York City. I don't know if you have settlement houses here. It's a place where immigrants can come to learn the language, to learn a skill. They had social services there where people could get help finding jobs, finding work, finding health care. This settlement house is still in existence today and still going strong and still doing the same kind of thing. He was on the board of Clara de Hirsch Home for Girls, which was the same kind of thing. So when immigrant girls would come, if they came alone, they had a place to live that was safe and got all those kinds of services. He was on the board of Montefiore Home for Chronic Invalids, which is today Montefiore Hospital, an enormous institution in New York City. He was interested in Jewish causes, but also in other causes that were not Jewish. He was always on the New York State Chamber of Commerce, and he was on the board of Hanover Bank for 27 years. The list of involvements is huge. January 1912, Isidor and Ida left for a prolonged stay in Europe. Their sons were minding the store. They would visit the spa towns, and the family still had a presence in Germany, so they went to visit. Their last stop was in Paris for some shopping, and then in London, where they stayed at Claridge's Hotel. Ida wrote to her children in New York that she couldn't find matzah, even though it was Passover. And she was sure that her grandchildren were rolling Easter eggs along the front lawn. Isidor and Ida's oldest son, Jesse, this is Jesse with his wife, and their 3 children, Jack, Beatrice on the other side, and Bob, who was born 1905. Jack would go on to become president of Macy's for 40 years. Jesse and his wife and their daughter Beatrice were traveling on a ship called America, going in the opposite direction. And Marconi's telegrams were a novelty then. So we have a number of telegrams that they pass back and forth. Fine voyage, fine ship, feeling fine, what news? That's pretty wonderful. But in a little while, a few days, it became really important that there was such a thing as cables, because that's how people were finding out about the Titanic, about the sinking. After spending the winter abroad, Ida hoped to find a new maid in Paris. But she couldn't find a suitable girl, so she hired one in England, who at the very, very last second decided she didn't want to travel abroad. And so they hired Ellen Bird, having no idea if this was going to work out at all. This is the very last letter. This is an important letter because it was the very last letter written by Ida. And it was written, as you can see, on Titanic stationery. She wrote it right after the ship sailed. The ship went to Sherbrooke, where it was mailed. And so we have direct evidence of her having been aboard Titanic. And I will read to you what she said, because it's all pretty important. Dear Mrs. Burbridge, she was the wife of the manager of Harrods department store. You cannot imagine how pleased I was to find your exquisite basket of flowers in our sitting rooms on the steamer. The roses and carnations, all so beautiful in color and so fresh, as though they had been just cut. Thank you so much for your sweet attention, which we both appreciate very much. But what a ship! So huge and so magnificently appointed. Our rooms are furnished in the best of taste and most luxuriously, as they're really rooms and not cabins. But size seems to bring its troubles. Mr. Straus, who was on deck when the start was made, said that at one time it looked painfully near to the repetition of the Olympian's experience on her first voyage out of the harbor. But the danger was soon averted, and we are now well on our course across the channel to Sherbrooke. Again, thanking you and Mr. Burbridge for your lovely attention and your wishes, and on the pleasant anticipation of seeing you with us next summer. I am with cordial greetings, which Mr. Straus heartily joins. Very sincerely yours, Ida R. Straus. It's a little strange that she signed it that way, because her name was actually Rosalie Ida Straus. And in the hundreds and hundreds of letters we have, I have never seen her use that R in any position, whether second or first. The Olympia was a sister ship to the Titanic. It was launched a year before, and while it was in harbor and started to pull out of its slip, because it was so huge, the churning of the water caused it to collide with another ship, the Hawk. And they didn't realize the turn, I guess it's called the turning ratio, how long it takes for these enormous ships. So that's what she was referring to. But again, it's the foreshadowing. I'm sure you all know about the sinking of Titanic, and I'm not going to tell you too many stories, but I will tell you, Ida stepped into the lifeboat thinking that Isidor was going to join her. He was offered a spot because women and children were not getting in, and there were empty spots. And he said, oh no, as long as there are women and children aboard, I'm not getting in. And he did not get in. When she realized he did not get in, she got out. And she said, I've married you for 41 years in sickness and health. I'm not leaving you now. We know this because there was a grocery buyer on the rescue ship Carpathia. And as the survivors were being brought aboard, he interviewed them. And then he wrote to the Strauses and he said, as much as I can tell, this is the most accurate description of what actually happened. Sarah, knowing she was not going to survive, gave her fur coat to Ellen Bird, who did survive, and went to the home of Isidor's oldest daughter, Sarah, to give the coat back. And Sarah said, oh no, my mother gave it to you, I want you to have it. And so she continued to have that coat. We wish we knew what happened to it. Ellen went to work in Tuxedo, New York, which is just up the Hudson River a little bit, for another family, Daisy Spedden, who was also a survivor. She and her son survived. Isidor's body was recovered, and it was brought to Halifax. Her body was not. And then on a train to New York, where he was first buried in the Strauss-Cohn's Mausoleum in Brooklyn. And then by 1930, the three sons of Isidor realized there was not going to be enough room for them and their children, so they moved Isidor's body to Woodlawn Cemetery, which is a very large cemetery in Bronx, New York. And so this, you have a picture here of the mausoleum. There are 3 buildings. The one in the back is for Jesse and his family. This one is for Percy and his family. There's a third on that side for Herbert and his family. In the center you see the replica of an Egyptian galley ship. And Isidor's body is buried in the ground just on the other side of that ship. Isidor and Ida shared birthdays. They were both born February 6th. And so on the wall on the other side is a lovely quote from the Bible, plus their birthdays. February 6th, died April 15th. We, the Straus Historical Society, decided on the 100th anniversary that it was time to republish this book. And so we added all of the articles that I had written and a few new articles that I had written to complete the story, to tell really about this unbelievable man and his family. And we also added photographs. And I've brought copies of that for you today. I would be happy to autograph them for anybody who wishes to purchase them. So as I've come to the end of my talk, I hope you've learned something new about the Strauses and a little bit about the connection to the sea. We have a Facebook page, and we'd love for you to like us and visit us there. We also have a wonderful website that Kat created, and we have a contact form on there. And if you have any questions, you want to just talk, you want to visit, you have stuff you want to share, I'd be happy to correspond with you. Isidor is on the far, Oscar in the center, and Nathan over here. I thank you, and I would be happy to respond to questions.
Bowers or specific naval questions that come up, you're definitely more suited to answer than anyone in the room. And any questions we want to take at this time, please feel free to ask.
Did they ever come back to Georgia and visit?
Yes, often. Often. The Strauses really never forgot their Georgia heritage, and even today. In 1923, they bought a firm called Koch in Toledo, and then they bought Davis and Paxton in Atlanta in 1925, and they were here in 27, 28 for the dedication of that, and on each time they came, they visited Talbot. Some of you who know Talbot know that there's a building there called Straus Levert Hall. It used to be a girls' school, and in 25, 27, the place was in disrepair, and the Strauses donated money to refurbish that building. Even today, family members come here. I'm often receiving little packets of photographs, well now digitally as well, pictures of their trip. They're very proud of their Georgia heritage. Jack Straus, Jesse's son, Isidor's grandson, was president of Macy's for 40 years. And we have lots and lots of news articles of his continuing relationship with the South, of his visiting. Oscar spoke at Springer Opera House in 1908, right? Yes. And there was a big dinner on the stage. So the Strauses really remembered, were appreciative, know they got their start in this country, and truly never forgot that heritage. Yeah.
Do you know where they lived in Talbot?
Yes, we do. In fact, we had some pictures out at Mike and Debbie's house, but we left them for them to keep. We have a photograph of the first house, which was this tiny little shack. Oscar described it so gloriously that I always imagined it to be this really lovely home. And then when I saw a picture of it, I couldn't believe that this was the house he was describing so beautifully. But it was a little small shack, a shotgun, but then later they moved to a second house. The first house is no longer standing. There's a marker. It's where the library is now. And there's a home site marker to it. The second house that they lived in, I don't know if there were subsequent houses, but the second house, the next house that we know about, is still standing and is privately owned. The people bought it in about 2000, Debbie, and they came from Atlanta and they promised to fix this house up, and they haven't done a whole lot with it, but it's still there. And we've been able to visit. When we were here in 2001, we were able to go inside and visit Ken, and Ken knows a lot about that.
Well, I happen to have a book about Talbot County, and that last house, there is a picture in here. I don't have my glasses, so I can't find it. And I was also going to mention that Debbie Buckner is in the audience, and Debbie and her husband Mike have hosted the Strauses.
Yes.
On a number of occasions.
On a number of occasions. They've been unbelievable. We stayed there. In fact, we've been with Mike and Debbie this week, and it's been phenomenal, an amazing visit. But Mike and Debbie are amazing historians, and I have benefited greatly from from their knowledge, particularly of the Straus's time in Georgia. It's been just a remarkable and wonderful association, and we're looking forward to.
One other thing, this is about the Strauses, not my family, but my mother was born and raised in that last house of the Strauses in Talkton, along with many of her first cousins, and I spent many of mine in that home.
When the people bought it in 2000, we visited in 2001, and they had started to scrape some of this old wallpaper off the walls. And I asked if I could have some. So I have this little piece of wallpaper that's got multiple stacks, and I could just imagine that bottom one was there when the Strausses. I keep thinking that if I ever had 10 minutes, I would take it to a paper conservator and see if I could get a date on it. But it's just so interesting and exciting to imagine that the Strausses saw that piece. Yeah.
Is it known why the Strausses moved to Georgia after immigrating?
Because they came to Philadelphia. It was an enormous German Jewish population there, and he wanted opportunity. So he was advised that there was a real frontier here, and he went because they said that maybe he knew that the Kaufmans were there because he went to the Kaufmans. I'm not 100% certain of that, but certainly he was advised that there was opportunity. He was in his 40s. I mean, it's remarkable that they had to start without a word of English.
That's the reason a lot of Jews came to Columbus, came to Savannah, came to all of these cities. My grandfather came over from Europe and settled in Manor, Georgia, because there were no merchants there, not a mercantile at least. And he roamed the country and then opened up his store. And spoke very little English.
Later on, in a slightly later era, all over the South, and I think as you go west, they had what they called Jew stores, because the merchants were always the dry goods. And so every community or every several communities had what they called a Jew store. But in that time, mostly they were peddlers, and then he wanted to bring his family, he wanted a stable environment, he felt he could make a living there, and so he settled, because that was the court, the court was there, and so the day he arrived, it was quite a bustling place, and he thought, I could do this. I must say that it is an enormous privilege to work with this family. They are absolutely extraordinarily wonderful and kind and generous, and they are mindful of their heritage, something that people in the North particularly don't care so much about. It's too much fuss and bustle, but they appreciate where they came from. They remember where they came from, and they're thrilled and delighted that it's being preserved. And it's really an honor and a privilege to work with them. And then, of course, to share it. That's the best.
Ladies and gentlemen, one final hand for Joan Adler.